Hi, this is Bart Welling at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, and my presentation is called Green Hearts, Gray Hands, Rethinking Hydrocarbons in Contemporary Film and Eco-Criticism. And I'd like to start with a little clip from a horror movie. It happens to be a horror movie that we're all inhabiting right now.
We have ended the war on American energy, and we have ended the war on beautiful, clean coal.
One thing that the 2016 U.S. presidential election made clear is that American culture's ways of thinking about petroleum, coal, and natural gas are broken. Donald Trump won in part by promising to end Democrats' so-called war on coal and usher in a new golden age of hydrocarbon exploration. Citizens in hydrocarbon-rich states from Alaska to West Virginia voted for Trump by overwhelming margins despite the fossil fuel industry's devastating impacts on human health in their own bioregions, whether or not they accept global warming science. The renewable energy sector continues to grow, but far too slowly to prevent a worldwide climate meltdown. It can be very tempting to blame our current predicament entirely on Trump or on oil company executives, the defiantly ignorant Republican Party, conservative manufacturers of global warming denialism, and so forth. To be sure, these engineers of future calamities deserve all the criticism they get for holding back progress on renewable energy transitions in the name of fossil fuel corporation profits and short-term political gains. One of their most insidious and effective strategies has been to promote the idea of hydrocarbons as energy, a quasi-magical force that is clean, ubiquitous, apolitical, powerful but benevolent, and virtually inexhaustible. However, as conservatives are fond of pointing out, environmentalists also depend in myriad ways on hydrocarbons. Their relationship with fossil energy goes beyond one of mere grudging and guilt-ridden physical dependence. Stephanie Lemenager shows in Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century how, from the beginning, middle-class environmentalism in the United States has been, quote, suspended within a culture of oil, despite sometimes violent protests to the contrary, as when protesters on the first Earth Day in 1970 smashed cars with sledgehammers and picks. Lemenager and other scholars in the energy humanities have illuminated how hydrocarbon dependence shapes, among many other things, the values and aesthetic standards of everyone in our petroculture, including those most staunchly committed to transforming modern society into a renewable energy culture. The ironies of petroaesthetics are on full display in films such as the popular 2001 French documentary Winged Migration. In the service of educating viewers about the extraordinary hardships that birds have to deal with while migrating, the directors of Winged Migration observe, in the companion book to the film, that they stationed film crews on all 7 continents where they shot some 300 miles of footage, recorded, I would note, on hydrocarbon-based film stock, and only around 0.5% of the footage made it into the final cut. But Winged Migration is also petrocultural in terms of its angles of vision and mise-en-scène. The film's many beautiful shots of geese and other birds flying in formation, which seem to capture perfect bird's-eye views, actually offer us the perspective of human camera operators in ultralight aircraft powered by liquid hydrocarbons leading flocks of trained birds. Petroleum is a medium here in 3 of the senses outlined in the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of medium. It is a physical material used for recording or reproducing data, images, or sound. It is a raw material or mode of expression used in an artistic or creative activity. And it is an irreplaceable part of the environment, conditions of life, or usual social setting, that is, the petroculture, out of which the wildlife film genre has emerged. However, the film proper avoids acknowledging its status as a petrocultural medium. It carefully leaves out shots in which visual traces of the ultralights, such as shadows and reflections, can be seen, and it replaces the sound of aircraft engines with a soundtrack consisting mostly of bird vocalizations and other natural sounds, mesmerizing music, and voice-over narration. Winged Migration approaches its subjects through a petrocultural lens that makes possible extraordinary views of the living world while concealing its own hydrocarbon-powered technological and aesthetic operations. Winged Migration is, of course, only one of countless environmental films that depend on hydrocarbons as media in these ways. It could be argued that many gorgeous helicopter shots of stampeding wildebeests and leaping dolphins in mainstream wildlife films are as much a celebration of the power of fossil fuels to liberate us from the tedious limitations and embarrassments of our own animality as they are about their ostensible stars, the animals. From this perspective, the term eco-media is something of a misnomer. Perhaps we should be talking about petromedia. This name would at least correct for some of eco-media's apparent hypocrisy, along with the general lack of transparency regarding eco-media's grounding in ugly petrocultural realities, problems that have helped limit eco-media's socio-political influences to a relatively small audience of self-defined nature lovers. Using the term petromedia would also help clarify how some films that seemingly reject petroculture in their rhapsodic embrace of wild nature actually encourage viewers to drive to national parks, fly to faraway vanishing Edens, and engage in other behaviors that are totally dependent on fossil fuels, and, in the end, may have a lot more to do with helping well-off individuals enjoy the pleasures of petro-transcendence of earthbound life than they do with doing anything that actually benefits non-human beings. Now, I'm only partly serious about rebranding eco-media as petromedia. After all, this would obscure crucial distinctions between films that powerfully challenge petroculture from within, and conversely, media designed to perpetuate the idea of hydrocarbons as legitimate energy sources. I'm thinking about the difference between a film like Leanne Allison and Diana Wilson's Being Caribou and your typical ExxonMobil commercial. On the other hand, in addition to the points of intersection between eco-media and petromedia that I mentioned earlier, petrocultural and ostensibly anti-petrocultural visualizations of the impacts of fossil fuels frequently have another major feature in common. They can both render hydrocarbons abject, either by hiding their true ecological and social costs behind the euphemism energy, or by representing these externalities as monstrous violations of the natural order perpetrated by evil corporations, rather than the results of billions of daily human decisions, large and small, associated with extracting the geologically transformed remains of ancient life forms from the earth and finding ways to use them in every possible domain of human life. Clearly, the time has come for re-examinations of the relationships between environmental media and hydrocarbons, re-examinations that attend as honestly as possible to the weird nature-culture blurrings that in the Anthropocene, or, if you will, in the Petrocene, blurrings that define life on every scale from the smallest plastic-contaminated sea creature to the overheated biosphere as a whole. The challenge is to move beyond reductive environmentalist dualisms and, simultaneously, avoid surrendering the field to those who view the petrocultural status quo as ideal. Eco-critics have much to add to discussions of the massive injustices and the astonishing pleasures of petroculture. One of our main goals over the next few years could involve redefining energy, opening up civilization-transforming conversations among the widest possible range of citizens, yes, including Trump supporters, so as to foster a renewable energy culture that will effectively redress the horrors and emptinesses of hydrocarbon life rather than simply repackage them with a shiny green label. What I'm calling for is a kind of green-gray media studies that remediates relationships between people and hydrocarbons, restorying and revisualizing these fields of interactions in dialogue with books, photographs, films, and other works of art that are likewise committed to exploring the intersections of gray and green worlds, and that are committed to doing so in non-abject, non-polarizing, non-apocalyptic, future-oriented ways. In the time I have left, I will quickly survey some scenes from recent documentary and fiction films that redefine energy and pose vital questions not just about transitioning to alternative energy sources, but about how we might re-inhabit our living world. Re-inhabitation is a core concept in bioregionalism, the international grassroots movement dedicated to transforming from within human infrastructures, but also values, narratives, art forms that have to do with how best to live in particular places. The films I analyze carry out the work of re-inhabitation not only by thematizing the physical re-inhabitation of places threatened or ravaged by petroculture, but by visually and narratively re-inhabiting older ways of representing entanglements of people, non-human living beings, and hydrocarbons, instead of rejecting outright these older ways of seeing. The films model 4 re-inhabitory practices that eco-critics would do well to take up ourselves as we try to transform the petrocultures in which we live. First, they make normally invisible hydrocarbons and operations of petroculture visible without rendering them abject. Second, they take seriously questions of human and non-human agency, including the agency of normally invisible workers and the non-sentient agency of hydrocarbons themselves. Third, they focus on their own immersion in petroculture, their own intimacy with hydrocarbons, in ways that open up dialogue across charged political, socioeconomic, and other boundaries. And finally, they redefine energy by situating it in bodily and bioregional terms, restoring to viewers a concrete awareness both of the larger costs of hydrocarbon-powered life and of these viewers' capacities as energetic beings in their own right. So on to non-abject visualizations of hydrocarbons. The first film I want to address is Paul Thomas Anderson's brilliant 2007 production There Will Be Blood, a very loose adaptation of Upton Sinclair's 1927 novel Oil. There Will Be Blood re-inhabits a classic genre of oil movies in which petroleum gushers function as unproblematic, monosemic signifiers of instant wealth and happiness for the individuals who discover the oil deposits, and of divinely ordained economic progress for society in general. Most obviously, There Will Be Blood re-inhabits older plots by way of its carefully crafted sets and costumes, which, aside from the fact that Anderson shot the movie in color, are basically indistinguishable from those featured in early 20th century movies. The film likewise pays homage to silent movies by eschewing all dialogue in its opening scenes. However, petroleum itself becomes a very different kind of character in Anderson's hands than in classic oil movies, in which oil is simply framed as black gold, an abject means to a glittering end, a fairy tale substance that more or less turns itself into money without requiring human intervention or leaving behind toxic residua. Daniel Day-Lewis's character, Daniel Plainview, does become enormously wealthy by the conclusion of the film, but from the title on down, Anderson fills his plot with conflicts between blood, particularly in the form of family relationships, and Plainview's obsession with petroleum, as well as the plot is also full of symbolic parallels between the oil and blood that highlight oil's preciousness and show how willing Plainview is to figuratively and literally sacrifice the lives of those around him in his quest to extract and sell what he calls, quote, a whole ocean of oil under our feet. There Will Be Blood resists the virtualizations of oil carried out in more conventional petrofilms by showing faces and bodies covered in oil and blood mingling as a dead worker is hauled out of a well, and, in the final scene, blood spreading like a pool of oil from the head of Plainview's rival, the preacher Eli Sunday, played by Paul Dano, after Plainview shatters Sunday's skull with a bowling pin. There Will Be Blood makes it impossible for viewers to simply think of petroleum as liquid wealth, as one 19th century journalist called it. By the same token, however, the film avoids rendering oil abject in ways familiar to viewers of TV news footage of oil spills. There are no oiled birds or scenes of refineries belching black smoke. An early shot in which oil splatters the lens of the camera shows that Anderson is clearly interested not just in making oil visible in new ways, but in owning up to his own place in petroculture, and in encouraging critical reflection on the part of viewers about how we see oil and how we see through oil as a medium. Human and hydrocarbon agency. Rethinking hydrocarbons with the goal of transforming modern petroculture into a just and fulfilling bioculture is going to involve training ourselves to stop thinking of hydrocarbons as fossil fuels, as viable sources of energy at all. There Will Be Blood participates in the work of redefining energy by exposing the normally hidden costs of oil extraction, showing that petroleum does not spontaneously flow from subterranean deposits into oilmen's bank accounts, as the terms black gold and liquid wealth erroneously suggest. A great deal of brutally hard, dangerous physical labor was required in the early 20th century to build derricks, drill wells, and refine crude oil. Rather like Moby Dick's narrator Ishmael, who exhorts readers not to waste whale oil because, quote, not a gallon you burn, but at least one drop of man's blood was spilled for it, Anderson's film tallies up the usually unseen costs of petroleum in the form of workers' lives lost, spilled blood, and relationships ruined, bad blood. Unlike a harpooned whale, a hydrocarbon deposit is obviously not capable of mounting intelligent resistance to the humans who want to exploit it, But There Will Be Blood endows oil and the tools people use to extract it with a kind of non-sentient agency that thwarts human intentions over and over in the film. A ladder rung breaks, sending Daniel Plainview plunging deep into a mine shaft and breaking his leg. A heavy drill falls without warning into an oil well, slamming into Plainview's partner's face. And the partner's now orphaned baby will be adopted and called HW by Plainview. Later on in the film's central blowout scene, HW loses his hearing as the drill rig he has been watching at work suddenly opens up a highly pressurized natural gas pocket, and HW is flung off the roof that he's been lying on. In a sense, Anderson turns hydrocarbons and oil industry tools into central non-human characters, reframing petroleum extraction as a dynamic field of relationships between humans and non-human things and forces, instead of as the simple and total human destruction of nature. Perhaps inspired by There Will Be Blood, Peter Berg's recent film Deepwater Horizon similarly focuses on the entangled agencies of oil workers, the technologies they employ, and the hydrocarbons they are trying to extract, in their case from a hole some 18,000 feet deep, located almost a mile beneath the ocean's surface. Through frequent, ominous, computer-generated shots of natural gas bubbling up from the ocean floor around the wellhead that was supposed to keep gas and oil from escaping, Berg builds suspense and portrays the hydrocarbons of the Macondo well as a monstrous presence that should have been left where they were. But despite its violence, the scene in which the blowout finally begins, which comes after many scenes in which BP executive Donald Vedrine, played by John Malkovich, has been arguing about the safety of the well with Transocean employees, including Deepwater Horizon manager Jimmy Harrell, played by Kurt Russell. This blowout scene showcases the complexity of the interplay of agents and forces that produced the disaster. Horizon features plenty of fireballs and shouting, but it re-inhabits disaster movie conventions by avoiding clean divisions of good and evil, and by refusing to treat the 11 men who died on the rig as anonymous, inevitable sacrificial victims. The film ends with a tribute to the fallen workers, before cutting to a much more familiar image, a shot of crude oil pouring out of the broken wellhead at the bottom of the ocean. Instead of haranguing viewers about their use of oil, the film respects the audience's agency too, inviting critical reflection about whether our dependence on hydrocarbons may have gone too far. Immersion in petroculture. Francine Kavanaugh in Adams Wood's 2010 documentary On Coal River makes visible the externalities of hydrocarbon extraction in rather conventional ways. For example, it profiles the terrible impacts that mountaintop removal, or as the coal industry prefers to call it, strip mining, has on the water supplies and thus on the health of residents of the Big Coal River Valley in West Virginia. But On Coal River re-inhabits the energy documentary genre by eschewing such elements as voice-of-God narration and talking head interviews, instead featuring footage shot by locals themselves, and handheld footage shot by camera operators guided by locals and edited so as to highlight the complexities of petroculture in a beautiful and biodiverse region whose struggling coal-dependent economy leaves citizens with few options besides participating in the destruction of their bioregion if they want to make a living there. While the film unequivocally sides with citizen activists such as military veteran Bo Webb, former coal miner Ed Wiley, who's shown in this scene, and the award-winning anti-mountaintop removal organizer Judy Bonds in their struggles against the coal industry, directors Kavanaugh and Wood make a significant amount of room in the film for pro-coal voices. These include industry spokesman Bill Kaler, who leads viewers on a tour of an actual strip mine, teachers and West Virginia state officials, and an unnamed woman at a rally in support of coal company Massey Energy, who tells the filmmakers, with some good reason, that without Massey there would be no jobs, there would be no economy, there would be no productivity in this area. Kavanaugh and Wood's immersive cinematography, their sometimes messy, realist plot structures, and their commitment to heteroglossia all contribute to On Coal River's project of revealing the historical and political contingencies obscured by the abstraction energy. Crucially, the documentary's re-inhabitory rather than oppositional approach to West Virginia culture opens up space for surprising new forms of environmental political work. New forms, but ones centered on an ancient concern, the love of place. In one of the film's most powerful scenes, Judy Bonds takes the filmmakers to her family's cemetery on a wooded hillside surrounded by coal processing machinery and roads bearing noisy coal trucks. Bonds, who expresses deep pride in her West Virginia heritage and the same southern drawl used by her pro-coal neighbors, bears practically no resemblance to the caricatures of big city environmentalists that typically appear in conservative rhetoric. The scene makes it clear that Bonds and other opponents of mountaintop removal are fighting not for an abstraction called the environment, but for their homes. Indeed, they are more conservative than so-called conservative politicians and fossil fuel industry executives in their desire to preserve place-based memories and familial attachments to landscapes threatened by fossil fuel exploitation. Bodily and bioregional redefinitions of energy. Being Caribou also intervenes in a supercharged political debate. The film documents a 6-month, 1,000-mile trek that Allison and her husband, Karsten Hoyer, made, sometimes walking, sometimes skiing, in 2003 in company with the massive porcupine caribou herd as the animals migrated from Canada's Yukon Territory to their calving grounds in Alaska's contested Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and then returned with their new calves to the Yukon. Allison and Hoyer conceived of the expedition as a way of publicizing what is at stake for caribou and other life forms in the long-running debate over whether ANWR should be opened up to oil drilling. As a constant reminder of the invisible but powerful connections between their U.S. oil politics and their daily experiences in the wilderness, Allison and Hoyer brought along a George W. Bush doll, which appears frequently in the film, usually in comic situations. And the film ends with the couple visiting Congress in Washington, D.C., where they deal both with the shock of being in a large city after 6 months in the Arctic and with the frustrations of trying to communicate the wondrousness of their experiences and the urgency of keeping oil companies away from the caribou's calving grounds in ANWR to lawmakers with little interest in matters of caribou survival. What makes Being Caribou so interesting from an eco-petrocritical standpoint is how the film marries its exploration of energy politics with an unusually rich investigation of interspecies politics. The species in question include not just humans and caribou, but grizzlies and wolves, wolverines and Arctic foxes, golden eagles, and many other types of birds, and insects and plants. The dramatically changing Arctic weather represents the most powerful non-human force in the film. At one point, Hoyer observes that his and Allison's movements are dictated by those of the caribou, whose movements are controlled by the clouds of biting insects that mercilessly harass and sometimes kill the animals, while the movements of the insects are constrained by constantly shifting wind patterns. By way of the loving responsiveness it shows to the landscapes traversed and the non-human beings encountered by Allison and Hoyer, the film builds a powerful implicit argument against petrocultural definitions of energy. In the Arctic, Being Caribou shows both living and fossil forms of energy are surprisingly abundant, but they come at a steep price. The film is especially good at dramatizing non-petrocultural and non-anthropocentric energy ontologies when it contrasts Hoyer and Allison's struggles as they try to follow the caribou herd through deep snow and up and down mountains while carrying 60 to 80-pound packs, contrasts their struggles with the caribou's seemingly effortless way of floating across the land. Allison and Hoyer address the camera several times in a state of deep exhaustion and hunger, describing how they can't eat fast enough to replace the thousands of calories they are burning every day. The film's emphasis on the limitations and joys of living energy comes through in its cinematography as well. Being Caribou re-inhabits the wildlife film genre by foregrounding the filmmakers' interactions with their non-human subjects instead of hiding them, and by only including solar-powered shots taken on the ground, sometimes from long distances away because Allison and Hoyer wanted to avoid scaring animals, or simply couldn't get close enough to them in time. What the film's earthbound shots lack in conventional dramatic tension, compared to aerial shots in a documentary like Winged Migration, they make up for by modeling a biocultural as opposed to a petrocultural orientation towards the living world, an orientation that holds tremendous appeal for viewers hungry for what David Abram calls conviviality with what is non-human. Being Caribou shows how we might put an end to the all-too-human loneliness that is a little studied but very significant cost of living in a petroculture. So before I turn this over to everyone else for discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to everyone's feedback, I'll just acknowledge that so far no film not even the Oscar-winning There Will Be Blood or the big-budget Hollywood production Deepwater Horizon, which, by the way, was a huge flop in the U.S. No film seems to have made much of a dent in Americans' attitudes towards energy. But the movies I analyze employ strategies that I believe could prove effective in promoting civilization-wide energy transitions. These films certainly model ways of seeing hydrocarbons that eco-critics would be smart to emulate as we come to terms with our deep investments in petrocultures that we simultaneously depend on for our survival and fervently wish to transform. So thank you in advance, everyone, and special thanks to Jessica Harden of the University of North Florida Center for Instructional Research Technology for helping me put this all together. So thank you very much.